Gigi Mitchell-Velasco on the organ. Thank you so much, Gigi. It is a distinct honor and pleasure to welcome all of you to the birthplace of H.P. Lovecraft here on his 125th anniversary of his birthday. So greetings to all of us from Providence, to all of you from all around the world. My name is Barnaby Evans, and I'm pleased to be your MC for tonight. How many of you were here 2 years ago? It's good. We're growing. The stars are in order. Did Niels make it? Is Niels here? Niels is no doubt working hard away in the office to be prepared for all the things that are happening for the next 4 days. To open our conference, I'd like to invite Ann Schwader to come up. She's a master of the Eldritch Sonnet. She's been featured in dozens of mythos anthologies, not only for her critically acclaimed poetry, but also for her chilling prose. She is the Riesling Award winner, and her collection of short poems, Wild Hunt of the Stars, was a finalist for the coveted Ramsey Campbell Award. Ann Schwader will be reading her poem, A Friend in Common.
A friend in common. We have a friend in common, you and I, whose mind entwined the cosmic with the past, in structures of imagination vast enough for multitudes. No mundane sky defined his vision, though he seldom strayed beyond the prospects of his native place. For long he dreamed the soulless depths of space to show us why mankind should be afraid. Now as a new star-turning draws us here, through certain angles to these antique streets he called his own, and all that might portend, we gather at this wellspring of our fears, where history and inspiration meet, to celebrate our far from common friend.
Thank you, Ann. And now to bring greetings from the Mayor of the City of Providence, it's my honor to introduce Lynn McCormack. Lynn McCormack has been the Director of Art, Culture, and Tourism for the City of Providence, and in her 16 years, she's got many projects, but she's successfully transitioned a position in an office into a full department that looks at community programming and economic development for the City of Providence. Lynn, we're so pleased to have you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being here. This is such a wonderful event for the city, and I want to welcome you all on behalf of Mayor Jorge Elorza, who couldn't be here today because he's actually traveling out of the country, otherwise he'd be here to welcome himself. I want to thank all of you for coming here to Providence for this wonderful event. I know many of you have traveled from very far away, and I can promise you that Niels and Carmen and Anthony have put on an amazing event for you over the next few days, and it's going to be a wonderful, wonderful time for you. You are all seated in the First Baptist Church in America, and when we say First Baptist Church, we mean the First Baptist Church in America. Many of the landmarks and historical properties you're going to see over the next few days are really amazing, and as many of you know, Providence and Rhode Island are really the home of radical thought and religious freedom, and you will find many haunted corners in the hotel that you're staying in the Biltmore, and all throughout our neighborhoods. I want to really thank Niels and Carmen in particular for putting this together and making H.P. Lovecraft's legacy so front and center in the city. It's a legacy that we celebrate here. It's a legacy that we're very proud of, and we're incredibly grateful for all of you coming here for this event to share all of your scholarly knowledge, your amazing art, And we're just so grateful for you sharing out the city. Many of the events will be open to the public as well, so we'll have a nice mix of folks from the city and interacting with all of you. And so I just hope you enjoy yourselves, and thank you for sharing all that you do with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lynn, and a big thank you to the entire City of Providence and the mayor's staff who's been entirely behind this conference. As Lynn mentioned, we are in the First Baptist Church in America, and I want to start by thanking the First Baptist Church for allowing us to gather here on the opening of this conference. This was indeed the church where H.P. Lovecraft, very briefly, went to Sunday school. I believe Les is going to talk a little further about that. But Lynn also talked about this Providence being a center for free speech. And Roger Williams established this city on the principle of freedom of expression, of freedom of speech, of freedom of religion, and of a separation of church and state. And again, it's a distinct honor to invite Stanley Lemons, J. Stanley Lemons, Professor Emeritus History at Rhode Island College, who specializes in the history of American culture, but he also, his scholarly interests covered everything from women's history, African-American history, and popular culture, and he's certainly a historian of the church and the building we're in. So to welcome us formally to this beautiful space, Stan Lemons.
I was here 2 years ago, and one thing I noticed is not as much of a Halloween aspect to this year. Lots of people last time were dressed in very bizarre costumes, so I missed that. But welcome to the meeting house of the First Baptist Church in America. And I will distinguish between those two things. The church is the congregation, the building is the meeting house. And I have to say that H.P. Lovecraft had this connection to this church because his grandmother and his mother and her two sisters were all members here. But he, as Barnaby suggested, was only briefly here when he got kicked out of the Sunday school for preferring the Lions against the Christians. But H.P. Lovecraft probably hated this church, but he loved this meeting house. This meeting house was an 18th century building, and he loved that architecture. And he also, as you all know, was a gloomy person who liked dark things and sort of decaying things. And when he was around here, that's what this building was like. It was a kind of dark and decaying place. The colors you see here now are completely different from what he saw. The walls were painted a kind of brownish color at that time. This high pulpit was not here at all. There was a big Victorian baptistry behind me with a stained glass window. And the ceiling was painted with big panels, all kinds of colored panels up here. And little wall sconces of gas lights. And when he was a teenager, they actually painted this building on the outside gray. Everything was gray because of coal smoke and caused it to be gray anyway, so they painted the building gray. And so it was, again, a kind of gloomy place. And the place was decaying. It was in bad shape. So bad by the 1920s that the community got at large to try to raise the fund, to try to save this building from falling down. So it was a gloomy place, and he loved it. He loved the building, he loved the architecture, he loved the kind of gloominess of it, I think. But as I say, he had only this brief, really, connection to the building itself. Should I say something about the organ? Well, he tried one time with some friends to come here and play the organ, but it was locked. And the man who had the key, who was Professor Arthur Watson of the Electrical Engineering Department of Brown University, was the person who had that key, and there was no way that Professor Watson was going to give H.P. Lovecraft the key to the organ. So they wanted to play Yes, We Had No Bananas, but they couldn't get it. Well, again, thank you for coming and enjoy your time here.
indeed a birthday. And I'm wondering if Gigi might be able to lead us all in singing Happy Birthday to H.P. Lovecraft. Now, he might turn over in his grave a few times, but I think something festive in this place on this day might be appropriate. So, Gigi? Thank you, Gigi. That was suitably gloomy. Our next speaker, who is Leslie Klinger, who's headed up here to the high pulpit, and is decidedly hotter up here, I warn you. His most recent book, which you may well know, is his annotated H.P. Lovecraft, which is fascinating with the physical and historical detail here. He's a New York Times best-selling editor. He did the annotated Sherlock Holmes, the annotated Dracula, and the annotated Sandman, which he did with Neil Gaiman. So it is my distinct honor to welcome Leslie Klinger, who's going to tell us HBL, his waking life.
Some of you know my history with copyrights recently, so I was waiting to see if Warner Chappell was going to swoop in and claim it for happy birthday. But we'll see. Biography is a challenge because, like any good storyteller knows, you have to choose a beginning point and an ending point. Traditionally, it's birth and death, but it need not be. But I'm going to stick to tradition today. I thought since we were celebrating the birthday of HBL that we ought to focus first on the man. So the external or waking life of Howard Phillips Lovecraft is simple enough to live. Details of his writing career will be considered separately by Ramsey Campbell. Peter Cannon is his essential H.P. Lovecraft, sums up the author's life's activities as follows: contributing to amateur journals, composing 18th century verse, revising the works of talentless would-be authors, and on occasion publishing highly original horror fiction in pulp magazines like Weird Tales, all far removed from the literary mainstream. Indeed, much of Lovecraft's day-to-day life was itself far removed from the mainstream as a matter of choice. Lovecraft was born on this day in 1890. He was born of solid New England stock. His great-grandfather had moved to Canada in 1827 and shortly thereafter to Rochester, New York. His mother's ancestors came to America in 1630, in the same year as the arrival of the Mayflower. He lived virtually his entire life here in Providence. He was born to Winfield Scott Lovecraft and Sarah Susan Phillips Lovecraft. He lost his father in a real sense almost immediately, but when Howard was 3, his father was confined to Butler Hospital for the Insane in Providence, where he remained until his death in 1898, almost certainly a victim of paresis caused by syphilis, though Lovecraft characterized it as nervous exhaustion. The young Lovecraft was raised by his mother, who was known as Susie, his 2 aunts, and his maternal grandfather. Apparently a prodigy, mastering the alphabet at 2, reading at 3, composing poetry by age 7, Howard nonetheless seems to have had an active and sociable childhood. In 1904, the death of his grandfather brought severe financial hardship to Howard's family, and he and his mother moved into a modest apartment. Always a sickly child, prone to nerves and fatigue, as a 14-year-old, he fell victim to illness, probably psychologically induced, and he dropped out of high school in 1908 after completing the 11th grade. By then, his health, quote, completely gave way, according to his own account, and he abandoned thoughts of college. Under the strong influence of his mother, Lovecraft was declared unfit for the military and sat out the Great War. For the next 10 or 11 years, Lovecraft occupied himself with amateur journalism. Despite his avowed worship of Edgar Allan Poe, whose works he first read at the age of 8, his passions were chemistry, astronomy, and the Greek and Roman classics, and these interests are reflected in his sparse writings during this youthful period. In 1919, a major change occurred in the young man's life. After extended periods of depression and what was then termed hysteria, his mother, too, was confined to Butler Hospital, where she died in 1921. Lovecraft's biographers have expressed various judgments of Susie Lovecraft. S.T. Joshi, for example, states that she psychologically damaged Lovecraft, at least to the point of declaring him physically hideous and perhaps in other ways that are now irrecoverable. Kenneth W. Fay Jr., however, asserts that Lovecraft's finely honed aesthetic sensibilities and seasoned artistic judgment were the result of her influence. He points out that she indulged the young man in developing interests in chemistry, astronomy, and various methodologies. What's that? On January 5th, 1924, Lovecraft wrote a letter to Samuel Loveman describing a visit. The first objective of our trip, he wrote, was that supreme landmark of Providence, the First Baptist Church, finished in 1775. He's talking about a trip that occurred really just a few weeks before. This is my maternal ancestral church, but I had not been in the main auditorium since 1895, or in the building at all since 1907, when I gave an illustrated astronomical lecture in the vestry to the Boys Club. We found this fane as pleasing within as without, partly the gloomy building was described. The paneling and the carving above the doors being especially notable as specimens of Georgian workmanship. We ascended to the organ loft, and I endeavored to play Yes, We Have No Bananas, but was balked by the lack of power since the machine is not a self-starter. Later, we explored the pulpit and the interesting baptismal font or celestial bathtub behind it, but I had had a cold tub at home, so it did not sample the sacred pool. Besides, I didn't know how to turn the water on. This is not quite the picture of gloomy Lovecraft. By the way, footnote, Yes, I Have No Bananas. Yes, We Have No Bananas was #1 on the hit parade for several weeks in 1932. 1931 is when it first was recorded by Eddie Cantor, who obviously Lovecraft was up on pop music, so it's a far cry from the gloomy man that we're used to thinking about. But back to the main story. Talking about Lovecraft's mother. My mother was, in all probability, wrote Lovecraft in 1921, shortly after her death, the only person who thoroughly understood me, with the possible exception of Alfred Gelman. Lovecraft's initial response to his mother's death was predictable. He wrote, "The death of my mother gave me an extreme nervous shock, and I find concentration and continuous endeavor quite impossible. Not long after, however, Lovecraft's health improved considerably. As he admitted, perhaps disingenuously, in a letter in 1931, my health improved vastly and rapidly, though without any ascertainable cause, about 1920 or 1921. A few weeks after Susie died, he attended a press convention, an amateur press convention in Boston, where he met Sonia Green, a Ukrainian Jew 7 years his elder, who had her own aspirations as a writer. At the time, Green was an executive of a hat shop in New York. He said of her initially, "Mrs. G has an acute, receptive, and well-stored mind." Others described her as Juno-esque and very attractive, but Lovecraft expressed nothing more until, after an apparently persistent courtship pressed by Sonia, they married in 1924. Marriage engendered surprise, shock, and even alarm among their friends, and Lovecraft's description of the relationship may well explain those responses. It began to be apparent, he wrote, that I was not alone in finding psychological solitude more or less of a handicap. A detailed intellectual and aesthetic acquaintance since 1921, and a 3 months visit in 1922, wherein congeniality was tested and found perfect in an infinity of ways, furnished abundant proof not only that SHG is the most inspiriting and encouraging influence which could possibly be brought to bear on me, but that she herself had begun to find me more congenial than anyone else, and had come to depend to a great extent on my correspondence and conversation for mental contentment and artistic and philosophical enjoyment. Lovecraft moved to New York, where he and Sonia took up residence at 259 Parkside Avenue in Brooklyn, now the Prospect Lefferts Gardens neighborhood of Flatbush. At that time, Brooklyn, with its farms and gardens, was viewed by many as a refuge from the bustle of the city, hard to believe. But the 1920s actually saw massive changes there, as roads were paved, sewers installed, and the Coney Island Boardwalk opened. And as crowds of immigrants arrived to stay. Lovecraft remained in New York for 2 years. Green, meanwhile, opened her own hand shop, which lasted for only a brief period. When she lost the shop, she found employment in Cincinnati, apparently for a want ad. And at the beginning of 1925, after only 10 months of cohabitation with Lovecraft, she moved to Ohio to work. She visited Lovecraft from time to time in Brooklyn and took care to send him money regularly. But after Sonia's departure, Lovecraft lived near the Red Hook neighborhood of Brooklyn, in a state of penury and near starvation. Although he had had hopes of success in the New York literary world, he made only slight efforts to find employment and spent his time with friends, which he seemed to have little or no trouble acquiring and cultivating. Lovecraft apparently hated the city. In a letter describing a brief trip to Philadelphia during this period, he contrasted New York and Philadelphia. None of the crude foreign hostility and underbreeding of New York. None of the vulgar trade spirit and plebeian hustle. A city of real American background, an integral and continuous outgrowth of a definite and aristocratic past, instead of an Asiatic hell's color of the world's cowed, broken, inartistic, and unfit. He despised the immigrant population. Sonia described his experiences walking in New York. Whenever he would meet crowds of people, she said, in the subway or the noon hour, on the sidewalks of Broadway, or crowds, wherever he happened to find them, and these were usually the workers of minority races, he would become livid with anger and rage. In a letter, she elaborates, he became livid with rage at the foreign elements he would see in large numbers, especially at noontime in the streets of New York City, and I would try to calm his outbursts by saying, you don't have to love them, but hating them so outrageously can't do any good. It was then that he said, it is more important to know what to hate than it is to know what to love. Alienated from the city, unable to write, and separated from Green, he capitulated and returned to Providence in the spring of 1926, where he remained for the rest of his life. Quote, in New York I could not live. Everything I saw became unreal and two-dimensional, and everything I thought and did became trivial and devoid of meaning through lack of any points of reference belonging to any fabric of which I could conceivably form a part. I was stifled, poisoned, imprisoned in a nightmare, and now not even the threat of damnation could induce me to dwell in that cursed place again. Neither he nor Sonia said much about the failure of the marriage. Lovecraft spoke of the need for the, quote, inviolate integrity of his cerebral life. Sonia told one friend that Lovecraft's hardening hatred of Jews was the primary reason for their estrangement and separation. But whatever their private reasons, the couple's divorce was never finalized. Lovecraft traveled occasionally in the eastern United States, but he appeared to prefer a frugal life at home. He lived alone until 1933, and moved in with his aged aunt, Annie Campbell, allowing the two to pool their meager resources. 3 years later, he developed cancer of the intestine and died a horrible, painful death in 1937. Now, this bare outline of Lovecraft's life reveals little of what must be deemed a nearly incredible amount of writing. This, however, will be dealt with by the estimate. Thank you.
Greetings. We felt as we moved into the writing and the ability of H.P. Lovecraft to be aware of creatures throughout the universe that we should invite some of them to join us tonight. And I would like to thank Big Nazo Lab for making that possible. They allowed us to Big Nazo has one of the few licensed teletransporters here in the East Coast, and they were able to dial these 7 creatures in to join us as Ramsey Campbell begins to look at the question of the mythos that H.P. Lovecraft constructed over his life and which has influenced so many people in the time since then. So I'd also like to thank Joe DeMarco for the drum. That. But before we go into Ramsey, thank you very much. We did talk about H.P. Lovecraft dying. He died in the Ides of March, and we did want to play a short lament to honor his passing. And this is the lament also by Henry Purcell, of Queen Dido, requesting that the bonfire pyre be lit by the waters and that we not forget her as Aeneas' ship goes across the Mediterranean. again, Gigi. Queen Dido, remember me, remember me. And we have all remembered H.P. Lovecraft magnificently because of the power of life that remains and will remain in his stories. Ramsey Campbell has been writing, and is still writing, horror and weird fiction since the late 50s. Famously prolific, his first mythos work was published by Arkham House in 1962 when he was only 16 years old, so that was 10 years ago or something. He's been dubbed Britain's most respected living horror writer by the Oxford Companion to English Literature, so what more sainted reference can we have than that? Ramsey, please join us up here and tell us.
Well, they think I'm living. I could wish the air were cooler. Well, I'm not going to say quite as much as I planned, but only because I'd totally forgotten that the text of it I was going to draw is actually printed in full in your very own copy of the damn, it's senility, you see. So I'll give you just a taste of it, and then I shall extemporize a little too. Now, I take Lovecraft as the most important single 20th century writer of tales of terror, horror fiction, weird fiction, you choose your term. His supernatural horror in literature, that great seminal essay on the field, isn't only an appreciation of all he found best in the genre and a critique of the flaws he saw in it, but it's a statement of his own artistic ambitions for the field, and his fiction gives those life. Now, I have to say, contradicting my genial host a little, that in a way, his reputation is the victim of his own most famous creation, the Lovecraft mythos, or as later writers always does in particular call the Cthulhu mythos, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. We may hope not, but otherwise the old chap might appear before us. The mythos, I'm sure most of you know all this stuff, so why am I even telling you? Maybe the odd person who's new to this stuff. The mythos was conceived as an antidote to conventional Victorian occultism, particularly as it was used in fiction. And basically the mythos was an attempt to reclaim the imaginative appeal of the unknown in only one of the many ways which his tales suggest greater or worse than they show. It's also just one of his means of reaching for a sense of wonder, which produces the visionary horror of his finest work, not all of which by any means belongs to the mythos. Now, I think the crux of what makes Lovecraft so important and so extraordinary is that in his admittedly brief career, 20 years of his mature work, span just about 20 years, he spent that time, most of it, in terms of his fiction writing, in trying to search for the perfect form for the weird tale, and he applied every method he could find to this search. So let me just kind of sketch a few of the methods and how these appear in what he did. Structure. I mean, Lovecraft was an absolute master of the structure of the horror story. I use the term horror story because my preferred one, he would have said weird tale, sure. An example, Dagon, a very early story, in fact one of the very early obscure stories. Interesting at once that it's utterly recognisable as Lovecraft. It could not have been written by anybody else, except maybe Lovecraft imitated, they would not have done it as well. And yet it is sort of anecdotal. It develops into themes that would become favourite throughout his career, which is deeply personal to him, clearly, to his imaginative life. Then a few years later, he returns to this in the Call of Cthulhu, or Cthulhu. And I think we can really see Dagon as being a kind of first draft for that later story, which, has one of the most extraordinarily complex and careful structures of any horror story that I know. Now, I was going to say at this point that my good friend, I refer to my good friend S.T. Joshi, but I fear he's confined to his hotel room and has not been seen by many today. although sort of nameless croaking can be heard beyond the door. However, ST, who knows far more about Lovecraft than I do, I'm going to say should be up there instead of me, he points out that the core pretty well has enough substance for a novel, and of course he's right. And I think it suggests one reason why Borges, the great Argentinian writer, to some extent the fantastic, admired Lovecraft so much, because Borges himself writes short stories that are effectively compressed novels. The second thing about the way that Lovecraft explored every possibility he could find, the voices of his stories. Now, there is this notion, and some of us admirers have been as responsible for this misconception as many of Lovecraft's detractors, that he only had one style. Well, I very much doubt somebody in this building who thinks that, but just in case, just to remind ourselves. On the contrary, he used an extraordinary number of different styles, from the delicately done Samian in, say, the Salted Key, the White Ship and so forth, the poetry of prose poetry of the outsider, the conversational narrative of Pickman's novel, the narrative sobriety of a lot of his first material work, The Color Out of Space and The Call being just two examples of that. And that kind of leads me on to the third point, which is his prose, which to my mind is some of the most extraordinary to be found in the entire field. It's crucial that Lovecraft unites the British and American traditions of the genre up to the point at which he started writing. So he takes from Poe in America, he takes from Machen and Blackwood in England, and other lesser things. And he's still learning as he developed it. So when he reads M.R. James in the mid-20s, I think you'll find little bits of James show up. There's a hint from Canon Alberic's scrapbook, where James uses, he shows us first an engraving of the demon, so that when the demon comes on in reality at the end of the story, he doesn't have to describe it again, because we can relate back to what we've already read as a description, which is very much what Lovecraft does in The Court Shooter a few months later. Equally, there's a line in Canon Alberic's scrapbook which says that everybody who saw this etching, or engraving, I forget which now, thought it was taken from the life. Now, those of us who remember Pickman's model may feel maybe that's where the germ of Pickman's model came from. I don't know. In any event, the real point is that Lovecraft, never stopped learning. But much more to the point, he never stopped searching. And it's actually this essay, which is in the programme book, I think it's worth giving a bit of background. It's a reprint, not apparent in here. A couple of years ago, I was asked to do an essay for a British critical anthology of writers on 19th and 20th century short story authors. So you've got Kafka, you've got Thomas Hardy, written about, and you've got me on Lovecraft, which I think indicates just how far Lovecraft's reputation has rightly come since his death. And so I reread three stories, also Dagon actually, I looked at that. But the ones I looked at very closely indeed were Rats in the Walls, The Call of Cthulhu, and The Color Out of Space. And I read these half a dozen times a piece over the last more than half a century. And I was amazed how much I missed, how much more there was to find that I still I'd never seen before. And what strikes me most strongly about those stories is the extraordinary modulation of style, the choice of language, and the extraordinary number of different modes of language you can find in each of those tales. There is actually a line, I can't get it verbatim, but in the Rats and the Walls, the narrator says something about the fact he must now go very carefully and choose his words. Well, that's pretty well Lovecraft's watchword as a stylist throughout his career. What can I say? There is a great thing I could say, but a lot of it is in this essay. Now, I don't have to preempt this, you can read this stuff at your leisure. So So I think I'll just say this basically. I can think of no writer in the field who is more worthy of close study and of rereading and of learning from, by which I don't mean just straightforward imitation, but learning and then, doing what you've learned from him in your own way. And the only sad thing is, he doesn't know all this, although, what is that thin figure behind the pillar? It just kind of scrabbled out and went back behind it. Maybe he does know. Thank you all.
Thank you, Ramsey. And our last speaker is another noted scholar on Lovecraft. This is Robert M. Price, and he is going to speak about the 2nd century of Lovecraft, the influence of H.P. Lovecraft. And Bob Price has been reading Lovecraft since 1967 and has written pieces on the Cthulhu mythos in 81. In 1990, he began editing mythos anthologies for Frederick and Bremer, and Chaosium Incorporated and others. His fictions is collected in Blasphemies and Revelations. I'm delighted to welcome Bob Price. One more second.
I feel like Frodo and Mordor scaling mountains. It occurs to me that we find ourselves well into the 2nd century of H.P. Lovecraft. Not bad for a self-described non-entity. Looking back, we must ask, what hath Cthulhu wrought? Many things. You and me, for instance. We are to be counted among the million favored ones. Lovecraft knew he had a gift to give to posterity, or at least to his contemporaries. Doubtful though he may have been that the yaps and nitwits who read his tales would ever appreciate them. That's how to characterize the readers of Poor Tales. And as he sent his stories forth like a chittering flock of night gaunts scattering from the nether pits, he was bequeathing something that would change the world. Nor is that hyperbole. Sure, not everyone on planet Earth knows of Lovecraft, but his work and his reputation have reached all corners of the world. Look how many nations are represented here this weekend. They've come far and wide. And his works have certainly changed our worlds, yours and mine. One need not be a Lovecraft Trekkie, and I hope I am not, but I cannot deny that the old gent kidnapped my imagination at a tender age, and it proved to be no adolescent phase. Indeed, the more I have learned in my life, the greater the depths I have marveled to see in Lovecraft's writings. Now, you may scoff and say that I'm merely reading new things into Lovecraft's text, but even if you're right, this can be possible only if the texts support it, if they fire the imagination and continue to do so as we grow. Looking back, what has sprouted from the potent seeds Lovecraft planted so long ago? He created a modern mythology which has evolved like any ancient mythology, though at a phenomenal rate of growth. The bards of the mythos included Robert Bloch, Henry Kuttner, Frank Belknap Long, Howard Smith, and successive generations with extraordinary gifts, as witness our friends Ramsey Campbell and Ann Schwader. Witness also so many young writers and artists present at this conference. It is a mighty wave crashing on night's Plutonian shore. HBO would have been absolutely amazed if he could have exchanged minds with the Yithian and viewed a future in which a growing number of scholars, formal and informal, had built up an imposing body of critical study of Lovecraft's stories, his letters, and his life. He would have roared in high-pitched laughter. After all, he regarded himself on a level with a sandwich man, utterly undeserving of any serious attention. But we're not fooled. He was a gentleman, and that meant he was humble and modest. But we know better, and he must have known better too. There's long been a Lovecraft cult, as Edmund Wilson, feel free to curse and spit, as Edmund Wilson called it, but we have witnessed the development of something else Lovecraft could never have envisioned, a Lovecraftian pop subculture replete with plush Cthulhu bedroom slippers, action figures, comic books, and role-playing games. I can't help thinking of what Max von Sydow's character Frederick said in the movie Hannah and Her Sisters. If Jesus were to come back today and see what's going on in his name, he'd never stop throwing up. Maybe Lovecraft would be vomiting too, but we don't have to. All those things are means of visiting the world of imagination that he conjured into being. We honor Lovecraft by enjoying it. Let me mention two things that did not grow out of Lovecraft's personal influence, but which he correctly foresaw. One is the rising tide of atheism and rationalism issuing in a rejection of religion. Some may have gotten direction from HPL on this point, having read his statement of his own naturalism and rationalism from his eloquent letters, and found them convincing, as they would have had those sentiments had the names Richard Dawkins or Christopher Hitchens on them. But in fact, more of today's crop of religion rejectors probably have learned their atheism from Dawkins, Hitchens, and a number of others. And of course, the scientific orientation of most science fiction fans may be said to have predisposed them, as it did young Howard, to atheism. But as rationalism ascends here, it declines there. And Lovecraft foresaw that too, and very clearly. If we can manage to look past his racism, we will see something deeper and quite valid. Lovecraft envisioned not only the threat that scientific knowledge poses to our anthropomorphic smugness, but also the ineluctable advance of the hordes of non-Western anti-rationalism to consume a decadent Eurocentric West. Superstition, barbarism, and fanaticism would sooner or later devour us. We can doubt that we're in the midst of this very assault. The bloodlust of jihadist who threatens Western civilization, and the effete, senescent West seems all too eager to go gently into that endless night. Our centers of learning have converted to power politics and an affirmative action epistemology, cynically redefining truth as ideology. Logic is undermined by the new axiom of the ad hominem. If white males formulated logic, then logic must be regarded as an instrument of oppression. Lovecraft was wrong about many things, but not, I think, this one. It's the real-life horror of Red Hook. I have seldom run into Lovecraftians who go so far as to try to imitate their hero, though S.T. Joshi's handwriting does look suspiciously like HPL's. But he has served as a model for us in one important way. Despite his reputation as a recluse, Lovecraft attracted more than one circle of devoted friends. The Calum Club, the Lovecraft Circle, his amateur press associations, and so forth. And like logs in a campfire, his friends caught the spark of his own fantastic creativity. That is a fire that has never gone out. It has ignited every one of us who gathered here for this NecronomiCon. We too are Lovecraft's century-spanning legacy. Let us prove worthy of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Well, this brings to a close our opening ceremony. Gigi has one more piece planned for us, but I once again wanted to extend welcome from all of us in Providence who have held H.P. Lovecraft's spirit dear for so long. We welcome you from all about the world to enjoy our city. You'll find it to be a magical place, and we very much are pleased to have you here. Gigi is going to lead us out with Henri Moulet's Tu es Petra, which is to St. Peter, you are my rock.